Welcome, everyone. I know many of you are here to relax and fall asleep. So let's start by getting comfortable. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the tension from the day slip away. Whether you're listening from your bed or a cozy corner, I'm here to guide you into a world of gentle chills and eerie tales to help you drift off. Before we begin, feel free to comment where you're tuning in from. I'd love to know. Now, just relax, let your mind wander, and let's get started with tonight's story. Chapter 1, the first thing I noticed about apartment 4B was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket, but the heavy sort that feels like it's watching you. I had been desperate to find an affordable place in the city, and when this unit opened up unexpectedly, I jumped at the chance. The leasing agent's nervousness should have been my first warning. The previous tenant left rather abruptly, she had said, shuffling through papers without meeting my eyes. But the unit's been thoroughly cleaned and renovated. I didn't ask questions. In this housing market, you learn not to look gift horses in the mouth. The apartment itself was unremarkable. Beige walls, cream carpet, and the kind of generic fixtures you find in any mid-range complex. But that silence, it seemed to emanate from the wall I shared with apartment 4A. In my first week, I never heard a sound from that direction. Not a footstep, not a door closing, not even the hum of a television. "Oh, Mr. Peterson?" Mrs. Chun from across the hall had said when I asked about my neighbor. "He keeps to himself. Been here longer than anyone else in the building. I've never actually seen him, but his rent checks never bounce." She laughed, but there was something forced about it. I tried to be neighborly at first, leaving a note introducing myself. It remained untouched for days before disappearing. No response came. I told myself this was fine. Plenty of people prefer privacy, especially in the city. But sometimes, standing in my kitchen that bordered his apartment, I could swear I felt something watching me through the wall. The first month passed uneventfully. I settled into my routine: work, gym, occasional takeout from the Thai place down the street. The silence from 4A became background noise, something I noticed but tried not to think about, until that night in October. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. At first, I thought it might be mice, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Like someone dragging their fingernails across the drywall. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Mr. Peterson?" The scratching stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Stress from work, too much coffee, and overactive imagination. But when I pressed my hand against the wall while getting dressed, I could have sworn it felt warm, like it was running a fever. The scratching returned the next night, and the next, always starting around 3 a.m., always with the same rhythm. I began to notice other things too. The hallway outside my apartment grew colder as I approached 4A, no matter how high the building's heat was set. Strange dark stains appeared on my kitchen wall, seeping through the paint like old coffee rings, only to disappear by morning. I started documenting everything, taking photos, making recordings. The scratching never showed up on audio, but I could capture the stains. When I showed them to the building manager, he just shrugged. "Probably water damage," he said, not looking at the photos. "Old pipes. You know how it is." He wouldn't meet my eyes either. Then came the night I heard the humming. It was a low, discordant sound, like someone trying to remember a melody they'd heard in a dream. It came through the wall in waves, accompanied by what sounded like movement, heavy, dragging footsteps pacing back and forth, back and forth. I pressed my ear against the wall, heart hammering. The humming stopped. Then, so close it could have been right next to my ear, I heard breathing. Not normal breathing. This was wet labored, like someone drowning on dry land. I jerked away from the wall so fast I nearly fell. That's when I noticed the smell, a sickly sweet odor seeping through the wall, like rotting fruit and old meat. I didn't sleep in my apartment that night, or the next. I stayed with friends, making excuses about plumbing issues. But I couldn't stay away forever. When I returned 3 days later, the smell was gone, but something had changed. The silence felt expectant, like the apartment was holding its breath. I started researching the building's history. The local library had digitized newspapers going back decades, and I spent hours scrolling through archives. Nothing seemed unusual until I found a small article from 15 years ago. Local man reported missing. Police seek information. The photo showed my building, and there, in a grainy image, was apartment 4A's door. The missing man wasn't Mr. Peterson. According to the article, a Thomas Wright had lived there, described by neighbors as quiet and reliable, until one day, he simply vanished. The police investigation found nothing suspicious. A week later, Mr. Peterson moved in, except when I dug deeper, I found no record of Mr. Peterson existing before that time. No social media, no public records, nothing. Just rent checks that never bounced, coming from an account that somehow always had exactly enough. The scratching got worse after that. It spread to all the walls we shared, sometimes several spots at once, as if multiple hands were clawing at the barrier between our apartments. The stains grew larger, darker, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like faces frozen in silent screams. I started sleeping with all the lights on, but they would flicker and dim around 3 a.m., no matter how many bulbs I replaced. Sometimes I'd wake up to find my furniture had moved slightly. Everything shifted a few inches closer to the shared wall. The breaking point came last night. I was in the kitchen, eating up leftover pasta, when I heard something new. A sound like wet meat slapping against the wall, followed by what I can only describe as a moan. Not of pain or pleasure, but of hunger. I dropped my plate. As it shattered on the floor, the sound stopped. Then, in the silence that followed, I heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, but clear as day, coming through the wall. "I can smell you." The voice was wrong. It sounded like multiple voices layered on top of each other. Some high, some low, all speaking in perfect unison. And it was familiar. So familiar it made my blood run cold. It sounded like Thomas Wright from old videos I'd found online. It sounded like the previous tenant. It sounded like me. I ran. Didn't even pack a bag. Just grabbed my phone and keys and ran. I'm at a hotel now, using their computer to write this down while I still can. Because I finally understand what's been happening. The stains I've been photographing, I looked at them again on my phone. Really looked at them. They're not stains at all. They're shadows of what's inside the wall. And they're growing. Mr. Peterson never existed. What lives in Flora isn't a person. It's something that wears people like clothes, collecting them, absorbing them. The scratching isn't coming from the other side of the wall. It's coming from inside it. From what's left of the people it's taken. I can still hear that voice in my head. I can smell you. And the worst part, when I close my eyes, I can smell it too. That sickly sweet odor of decay. Only now it's not coming from next door. It's coming from my own skin. I'm writing this as a warning. If you're looking for an apartment and find one that seems too good to be true, with a quiet neighbor you never see, pay attention to the silence. Sometimes the quiet isn't empty at all. Sometimes it's full of teeth. Last edited just now, chapter 2. I should have known something was wrong the moment we stepped into the house. The real estate agent had called it a historical gem. But there was nothing precious about the way the floorboards creaked beneath our feet or how the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the corners. My wife, Sarah, saw potential. Our daughter, Emma, saw a big backyard. I saw something watching us from behind the curtains. But the price was right. Suspiciously right, I realize now. And after months of house hunting, we were desperate to leave our cramped apartment. The previous owners had died peacefully in their sleep, according to the agent. She didn't mention they'd died on the same night, in different rooms, with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. I learned that later, much later, when it was already too late. The whispers started on our first night, just quiet enough to dismiss as settling pipes or wind in the walls. But there was something about their cadence that made my skin crawl, like fragments of conversations just beyond comprehension. Sarah said I was being paranoid. Emma, only 7, asked why the house was singing to her. I found her the next morning, pressing her ear against the living room wall, giggling. "They're telling stories, Daddy," she said. Her small hand splayed against the faded wallpaper. "Sad stories." That should have been our second warning. Instead, we chalked it up to an active imagination and the excitement of a new home. We spent that first week unpacking, painting, trying to make this dark old house feel like ours. But you can't really own a place like this. It owns you. The whispers grew louder as October wore on. They came mostly at night, starting as meaningless murmurs, but gradually becoming clearer. I'd wake at 3 a.m. to hear what sounded like children playing, their laughter echoing through the heating vents. Sarah would jolt awake, convinced someone had whispered her name directly into her ear. But it was Emma who heard them most clearly. We'd find her having conversations with empty corners, nodding and responding to questions we couldn't hear. When we asked what she was talking about, she'd look at us with confusion. "Can't you hear them?" she'd ask. "They're so loud." One night, I found her sitting cross-legged in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. When I asked what was wrong, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "They're all so sad, Daddy," she whispered. "They didn't want to die." I carried her back to bed, trying to ignore the way the whispers seemed to follow us down the hall. As I tucked her in, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "They say we should join them," she said. "They say it's better on the other side." I started researching the house's history the next day. The local library had records going back to its construction in 1887. The pattern was impossible to miss once I started looking. Every family that had lived here, every single one, had died in the house. Some were ruled accidents, others natural causes, but they all shared one detail. They died within a year of moving in. The original family, the Blackwoods, had been the first. All 5 of them found dead one morning. No signs of violence or struggle. The official report claimed it was gas leak, but there had been no gas lines in the house at the time. Their bodies were discovered arranged in a perfect circle in the basement, hands linked, faces frozen in expressions of rapture. As I dug deeper, the whispers grew more insistent. They weren't just at night anymore. They came in the middle of the day, during dinner, while we watched TV. Each of us heard different things. Sarah heard promises of peace, of eternal rest. Emma heard playmates, children who would never grow up, never leave her. I heard the truth. They showed me visions, flashes of all the deaths that had occurred within these walls. The Blackwoods hadn't died from a gas leak. They'd been the first sacrifice, the catalyst that turned this house into something else. A doorway, maybe, or a hungry mouth. Each family that followed had been led, step by step, to join them. The whispers would start soft, promising, then grow more demanding until... I found Sarah in the basement one night, standing in the exact center of the room, swaying slightly. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with blank eyes. "They're so persuasive," she murmured. "They show me such beautiful things." I tried to lead her upstairs, but she resisted. "Don't you want to be together forever?" she asked, but it wasn't her voice. It was older, hollow, like wind through dead leaves. All of us, peaceful, eternal. No more pain, no more fear. I managed to get her back to bed, but when I checked on Emma, her room was empty. I found her in the attic, sitting in front of an old mirror that hadn't been there the day before. Her reflection wasn't quite right. It moved a fraction of a second too late, smiled a little too wide. "The children want to play," she said, but like Sarah, the voice wasn't hers. They'd been so lonely. That's when I noticed the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. They weren't just darkness. They were shapes, figures, reaching out with long, pale fingers. The whispers had become a chorus. Dozens of voices promising peace, rest, eternal togetherness. I could see them clearly now. All the families that had lived and died here. The Blackwoods, still holding hands after all these years. The Millers from 1923. The Chens from 1956. The Rodriguezes from 1989. All of them smiling, beckoning, their forms flickering like old film. Join us, they whispered. Be part of something greater. Be part of us forever. For a moment, I almost believed them. Their promises were so sweet, their voices so soothing. Wouldn't it be better to stay here, together, safe from the world's pain? I felt myself swaying, reaching out. Then Emma screamed. Not the hollow voice from before, but my daughter's real voice, terrified and so very young. It broke whatever spell had been woven around us. I grabbed her, ran to Sarah's room, and shook my wife awake. The shadows followed us, clawing at our heels as we fled down the stairs. The house didn't want us to leave. Doors slammed shut in our faces, floors buckled beneath our feet, and those voices, those terrible, beautiful voices, promised and threatened in the same breath. But we made it out, all of us, just as the sun was rising. We never went back for our belongings. Let the next family find our things, our photos, our memories. Maybe they'll serve as a warning, though I doubt it. The house knows how to choose its victims, knows how to whisper just the right words to draw them in. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. They follow me in dreams, showing me glimpses of what could have been eternal peace, eternal family, eternal love. But I've learned to recognize them for what they are. Echoes of the dead, calling out in hunger, always hungry for more. The house is up for sale again. I drive by sometimes, watching young families tour it with bright eyes and hopeful smiles. I want to warn them about the whispers, about the shadows that move in the corners, about the promises that turn to chains. But who would believe me? Besides, the dead are patient. They have all the time in the world to whisper, to persuade, to welcome new members into their eternal family. And sooner or later, someone will listen. Just listen for the whispers. They're always there, just quiet enough to make you lean in closer, just loud enough to make you doubt your sanity. And once you start hearing them, they never really stop. They're whispering right now. Chapter 3, I never should have bought that mirror. But there it was, propped against a weathered table at the flea market, its ornate bronze frame catching the autumn sunlight. The old woman selling it practically gave it away. $15 for what looked like a genuine antique. Her hands trembled as she took my money. No returns, she said, her voice sharp with what I now recognize as fear. Once it's yours, it's yours. I was too busy congratulating myself on the find to notice her reaction. As a broke college student furnishing my first off-campus apartment, I couldn't believe my luck. The mirror was perfect, tall enough to show my full reflection, with an intricate pattern of vines and leaves carved into its frame. A few tarnished spots and scratches only added to its character. The first few days were unremarkable. The mirror hung on my bedroom wall, opposite my bed, reflecting my cluttered student life. Piles of textbooks, coffee cups, my laptop perpetually open to unfinished essays. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed something odd. I was getting ready for class, brushing my teeth while checking my reflection. I lowered my toothbrush, but my reflection continued brushing for a fraction of a second longer. Just a tiny delay, barely noticeable. I blinked and everything synchronized again. I convinced myself it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But then other small discrepancies began to appear. A book would be closed in reality, but open in the reflection. My phone would show up on the opposite side of the desk. Little things, easy to dismiss, yet increasingly difficult to ignore. I started taking photos of the mirror, trying to document the differences. But whenever I reviewed the pictures, everything looked normal. The inconsistencies only appeared in direct observation, as if the mirror was playing a private game with me. Then came the night I saw the figure. I was up late studying for midterms, trying to keep my eyes open as I reviewed my notes. Movement in the mirror caught my attention. In the reflected world, a shadow darker than the darkness around it stood in the far corner of my room. When I turned to look at the actual corner, nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow remained, watching. My rational mind searched for explanations. A trick of light, stress-induced hallucinations, too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The shadow had been person-shaped, but wrong somehow, like a child's drawing of a human made three-dimensional. Each night after that, the figure appeared again, always in the mirror's version of my room, always a little closer to my reflected self. I started covering the mirror before bed, but every morning the cover would be on the floor, no matter how securely I fastened it. I tried to research the mirror's history. The flea market where I bought it was held monthly in a church parking lot, and the old woman never returned. But I found something interesting in the university's digital archives. A series of local newspaper articles from the 1950s about a string of disappearances. Each missing person had recently acquired an antique mirror with bronze details. My sleep suffered. I'd wake up at odd hours, drawn to the mirror like a moth to flame. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection smiling when I wasn't, or making subtle movements I hadn't made. The dark figure grew bolder, no longer hiding in corners, but standing openly in the reflected room. One night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the mirror, though I had no memory of getting out of bed. My reflection stared back, but its eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark, too hungry. The shadow figure stood directly behind my mirror self, its form more defined than ever. It had no face, just smooth, dark skin stretched over a roughly human shape. As I watched, unable to move, it placed its hands on my reflection's shoulders. My reflection smiled. I did not. I tried to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. In the mirror, the figure's hands began to sink into my reflection's flesh, like ink spreading through water. My reflection's smile widened impossibly, its teeth too sharp, too numerous. "Your turn," it whispered, though my own lips remained still. That was when I noticed I could feel pressure on my shoulders, cold and heavy, though nothing was behind me in the real world. My reflection reached out, pressing its palms against the glass. The barrier between our worlds felt thin, fragile. In desperation, I managed to break free of whatever force held me in place. I ran from the room, slept on a friend's couch, and returned the next day armed with research from the university's occult collection and a hammer from the hardware store. But the mirror had changed. My reflection was gone completely, replaced by the dark figure. It filled the entire frame, pressing against the glass like a prisoner at a window. Behind it, I could see others, countless shadowy forms reaching out, their movements jerky and wrong. Among them, I glimpsed faces I recognized from the missing persons articles. As I watched, horrified, the glass began to ripple like water. A hand, dark, smooth, impossibly long, began to push through, reaching for the real world. I didn't hesitate. The hammer struck true, shattering the mirror into countless pieces. Each shard reflected the dark figure, fractured and multiplied, its silent scream visible in dozens of broken reflections. Then the fragments grew dark, like burnt paper, and crumbled to dust. I swept up the remains and buried them in multiple locations, scattering them as widely as I could. The bronze frame I melted down at the art department's foundry, mixing it into a sculpture project until it was unrecognizable. But even now, years later, I catch myself looking too long in reflective surfaces. Windows, computer screens, even still water. Sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I see movement that doesn't match reality. A dark shape, patient and hungry, waiting for another chance to bridge the gap between its world and ours. And sometimes, when I look quickly enough, my reflection takes a moment to hide its smile. Last week, I was walking past an antique store when I saw it. Another mirror, different frame but same distinctive vine pattern along the edges. Through the window, I watched a young woman admiring it, reaching for her wallet. I wanted to warn her. I should have warned her, but my reflection in the store window shook its head and my lips stayed sealed. After all, the mirror needs to feed. And next time, it might let me be the one reaching through the glass, adding another shadow to its collection. I just have to wait and watch and let my reflection guide me home. They say a broken mirror brings 7 years of bad luck, but some mirrors, when they break, release something far worse than bad luck, something that lives in the spaces between reality and reflection, always watching, always waiting for someone to look too long, too deep into the wrong mirror. So check your reflection carefully. Make sure it matches your movements exactly. And if you ever see it smile when you're not smiling, run. Chapter for the listing called it a unique architectural marvel. That should have been our first red flag. Real estate agents don't use words like unique unless something's wrong. But Claire and I were too enchanted by the price, a Victorian mansion for less than a Boston condo, to question it. The house sat alone at the end of a winding private road, surrounded by ancient oaks that blocked any view of neighboring properties. 17 rooms, the agent said, though she seemed uncertain. The layout can be confusing, she admitted, shuffling through her papers. Previous owners have reported varying room counts. We laughed it off. Old houses settled, play tricks with shadows and sound. We were just grateful to find something we could afford with my new remote job and Claire's art studio requirements. The agent seemed relieved when we signed the papers, almost too eager to hand over the keys. Moving in took days. The rooms seemed to spiral endlessly, each one opening into another unexpected space. We discovered a conservatory with stained glass windows, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, and countless bedrooms, each with its own distinct character. But it was a room at the end of the third floor, east wing, that caught our attention. It was perfectly square, maybe 15 feet on each side, with dark wood paneling and a single window overlooking the back garden. The strange thing was the furnishings. A Victorian fainting couch, a brass telescope pointed at nothing, and a mechanical music box that we could never get to work. Something about the room felt wrong, like the angles weren't quite right, but we couldn't put our finger on why. "This'll make a perfect meditation room," Claire said, already planning where to put her yoga mat. I nodded, though something about the space made my skin crawl. We didn't notice anything strange until our third day in the house. I was giving my parents a virtual tour, proudly showing off our new home. "And this is a meditation room," I said, turning down the east wing. But where the room should have been, there was only a blank wall. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at solid plaster, where a doorway had been just that morning. Must have taken a wrong turn. I told my parents, but I hadn't. I knew this house's layout like the back of my hand already. The room had vanished. When I told Claire, she thought I was playing a joke. "We were just in there this morning," she said, heading up to the third floor. But she stopped short when she saw the wall. We spent hours searching for the room, convinced we must be missing something, but it was simply gone. Then, just as mysteriously, it reappeared the next day. Everything was exactly as we left it. The fainting couch, the telescope, even Claire's yoga mat rolled up in the corner. We took photos, measured the walls, tried to document its existence. Claire even set up her camera to record time-lapse footage of the doorway. But the next day, it was gone again. The camera showed nothing, just static the moment the room should have disappeared. The pattern continued. Present one day, gone the next, like the house was breathing, inhaling and exhaling this impossible space. We should have left then. Any sane person would have. But Claire was fascinated. She started keeping a journal, tracking the room's appearances and disappearances, noting any changes. I caught her sitting outside the doorway for hours when the room was there, just watching, taking notes. "Don't you feel it?" she asked one night. "It's like it's calling to us." I did feel it. On the days the room was present, I'd find myself drawn to it, standing in the doorway without remembering how I got there. The telescope always seemed to be pointing in a different direction, though neither of us ever touched it, and sometimes very faintly. We could hear the music box playing, though it remained stubbornly silent whenever we tried to wind it. Then came the night that changed everything. I woke to find Claire's side of the bed empty. A quick check of my phone showed it was 3:33 a.m., and a day when the room should have been gone. But I could hear music, faint and tinkling, from the third floor. I found Claire standing in front of the room that shouldn't have been there. The door was open and soft. Golden light spilled into the hallway. The music box was playing a melody I'd never heard before, something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "It's beautiful," Claire whispered. She took a step forward. "Wait," I called, reaching for her arm, but she was already crossing the threshold. The moment she entered the room, everything changed. The golden light turned harsh, revealing impossible angles in the corners of the room. The walls seemed to pulse, and through the window, I saw not our back garden but a vast, starless void. Claire turned back to me, her face radiant. Behind her, the telescope swiveled on its own, pointing directly at us. The music box's melody grew louder, more discordant. "Come see," she said. But her voice was wrong, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "It's what we've been looking for." I stepped forward, drawn by her voice, by the light, by the promise of understanding what lay behind this impossible room. But as my foot crossed the threshold, I saw them. They were standing behind Claire, transparent figures, barely visible in the strange light. I recognized the couple from the old photographs we'd found in the library, the house's original owners. Next to them stood a family in 1950s clothing, then a young man in bell-bottoms, a woman in 1980s business wear, and others, so many others. All smiling, all beckoning, all trapped. I stumbled backward just as the room began to fade. Claire's expression changed from serenity to terror as she realized what was happening. She lunged for the doorway, but it was too late. The last thing I saw was her hand reaching out, passing through the space where the doorway had been, becoming transparent like the others. Then the wall was solid again, and I was alone in the hallway. The room never appeared again after that night. I searched for Claire, of course, called the police, hired private investigators, tried to explain what had happened. They searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. According to county records, every previous owner of the house had disappeared in similar ways, declared missing, cases gone cold. I still live here. I have to. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the music box playing behind the wall where the room used to be. Sometimes I catch glimpses of Claire in mirrors or windows, smiling, beckoning, her form transparent and ageless. And sometimes, in my dreams, I understand what the room really is. Not just a space, but a door, a hungry mouth, a collector of souls. The house is mine now, in all its impossible geometry. I maintain it, clean it, welcome the occasional interested buyer. Young couples, usually, drawn by the price and the promise of all these rooms. They never notice how I avoid the third floor, how I hurry them past that particular hallway. I should warn them, I suppose. But then I catch Claire's reflection in a window, see her shake her head, and I remember my role. After all, the room needs to feed. And maybe, just maybe, if I help it collect enough souls, it will open one last time. For me, for us, forever. So if you're house hunting and find a too-good-to-be true deal on a mansion, count the rooms carefully. Then count them again. And if the numbers don't match, if you find a perfect square room with a fainting couch and a telescope and a music box that doesn't quite work, run. Run before you hear the music. Run before you see what's really through that window. Run before you become just another transparent figure, forever beckoning to the next owner from behind the walls of the vanishing room. Chapter 5. My daughter Alice had always been sensible about toys. She never threw tantrums in stores or begged for the latest trendy plaything. So when she became obsessed with that porcelain doll in the antique shop window, I should have known something was wrong. "Please, Mommy," she whispered, pressing her small hands against the glass. "She's so lonely. She needs me." The doll sat primly on a faded velvet cushion, wearing a Victorian-style dress of pale blue silk. Its blonde curls were perfectly arranged, its painted lips set in a gentle smile. The price tag read simply, "Charlotte, best offer." The shop owner seemed unusually eager to sell. "A lovely piece," she said, wrapping the doll carefully, "though some children find her challenging." She hesitated, then added, "No returns, of course." Alice clutched the box the whole way home, whispering to it softly. When my husband Tom asked what she was saying, she looked up with serious eyes. "Charlotte's telling me her secrets." That first night, we placed the doll on a shelf in Alice's room. Its glass eyes caught the light from the nightlight, gleaming like tiny stars. I remember thinking they looked almost wet. "Good night, Charlotte," Alice said as I tucked her in. I could have sworn the doll's head tilted slightly, but surely that was just shadows playing tricks. The trouble started at breakfast. Alice came downstairs, rubbing her eyes, and asked why we moved Charlotte to the kitchen counter. We hadn't. The doll sat there facing our usual breakfast spots, though I distinctly remembered leaving it on the shelf. "Must have sleepwalked," Tom suggested, but Alice shook her head. "Charlotte walks by herself," she said matter-of-factly. "She gets lonely at night." Over the next few days, the doll appeared in increasingly improbable places. We'd find it in the living room, positioned to watch TV, or in the hallway, facing our bedroom door. Once, I found it sitting at my desk, its tiny porcelain hands resting on my laptop keyboard. Then the crying started. It was soft at first, barely audible. The kind of sound you convince yourself is just the wind or settling pipes. But it grew clearer, more distinct. A child's sob, echoing through the house in the darkest hours of the night. "Charlotte's sad," Alice explained when we found her awake at 3 a.m., patting the doll's head. "She misses her other family." "What other family?" I asked, but Alice just shrugged. "The ones who left her behind." She says there have been many. Tom wanted to get rid of the doll. We tried donating it to Goodwill. But the next morning, Charlotte was back on Alice's shelf, her dress slightly dirty as if she'd traveled far. We tried locking it in the garage. It appeared in our bed, nestled between our pillows. When Tom threw it in a dumpster across town, it showed up in his car's passenger seat during his commute home. And each time we tried to dispose of it, the crying grew louder. I started researching the doll's history. The antique shop had closed suddenly. Its owner vanished. But I found mentions in local social media of a similar doll appearing in yard sales and thrift stores across the state. Always the same description. Victorian dress, blonde curls, glass eyes that seemed to follow you. Always the same pattern. A child would become attached, insist the doll was lonely, and then the post would stop. The crying changed too. Some nights it sounded like multiple children sobbing in unison. Other nights, it was more like laughter, high, brittle, and wrong. We'd wake to find tiny wet footprints leading to and from Alice's room. But they'd fade before we could photograph them. Alice grew paler, more withdrawn. She spent hours talking to Charlotte, their heads bent together like conspirators. Sometimes I'd catch fragments of their one-sided conversations. "Yes, I understand. But what about Mommy and Daddy? Will it hurt?" The final straw came when I found Alice's diary. Among her usual second-grade scrawlings were pages of elaborate Victorian script, written in faded brown ink that smelled metallic, like old blood. "My dearest Alice." One entry read, "You remind me so much of my first friend. She joined our game willingly, as I hope you will. It can be quite lonely being the only child in our collection. We took Alice to stay with her grandparents that night. Tom and I returned home determined to end this, whatever it took. We found Charlotte in the kitchen, surrounded by every sharp knife we owned, arranged in a perfect circle pointing outward. The doll's painted smile seemed wider than before. I remembered reading that cursed objects should be purified by fire, so we took Charlotte to the fire pit in our backyard. As Tom doused her in lighter fluid, the crying started, not just from the doll, but from everywhere. The air filled with the sobs of countless children. The doll's head turned. Not just a trick of the light this time, but a deliberate movement. Its glass eyes met mine, and I saw depths there. Impossible depths filled with small, pale faces pressed against the glass like children behind a frosted window. "We just want to play," Charlotte said, its porcelain lips moving stiffly. The voice was a chorus of children speaking in unison. "We get so lonely." Tom struck the match. The crying reached a fever pitch. Just before the flames caught, I saw tears, real tears, rolling down the doll's porcelain cheeks. It burned for hours, far longer than it should have. The smoke that rose was thick and black, carrying the sounds of children's laughter that faded into the night sky. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but ashes. We thought it was over, but last night, Alice called from her grandparents' house. "Charlotte found me, Mommy," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "She says I can join the game now. We're all going to play together forever." By the time we arrived, Alice was gone. The only trace was a porcelain doll on her bed, wearing a pale blue dress, its glass eyes wet with tears. But it wasn't Charlotte. The doll had dark hair, just like Alice. Its painted lips wore her gentle smile, and when I picked it up, its ceramic skin was still warm, as if it had just been fired in a kiln. Now it sits on my shelf, next to a growing collection of other dolls. Some nights, I hear them whispering together. Some nights, I hear them cry. And some nights, when the moon is dark and the house is quiet, I hear my daughter's voice among them, calling for me to join their game. I think soon I will. After all, no one should have to play alone. Chapter 6 had started on a Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable Tuesday that blurs into all the others, except for that call. My phone rang at exactly midnight. Not 11:59, not 12:01, but midnight on the dot. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Who calls at midnight on a Tuesday? But something made me pick up, some nagging feeling I couldn't shake. "Hello." Static crackled on the line, then cleared. "Hey, Mark. Long time no talk, buddy." The voice was familiar, tugging at old memories, but I couldn't quite place it. Who is this? Come on, man. It's David. From Highland High? We used to hang out behind the gym during lunch, remember? David Mitchell. The name hit me like a physical blow. We'd been inseparable in high school. The kind of friendship that seems eternal at 16, but somehow slips away in the rush of college and careers. I hadn't thought about him in years. David? Wow. It's been forever, right? He laughed, and something about the sound made the hair on my neck stand up. "Listen, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Remember that time we broke into the school pool at night?" I did remember. Summer before senior year. Drunk on cheap beer and invincibility. Yeah. The security guard almost caught us. We hid in the equipment shed for hours. "You were so scared," David said, his voice oddly flat. "But not as scared as you should have been." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. What had he meant by that? I tried calling back, but got an automated message saying the number wasn't in service. The next night, exactly at midnight, he called again. Remember when we used to talk about what we'd do after graduation? His voice sounded different somehow, hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "You were going to be a lawyer. I was going to travel the world. Funny how things work out." "David, what happened to you?" "We lost touch after I disappeared." He laughed that wrong laugh again. Is that what they called it? What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, Mark. You were there. Click. My hands were shaking as I Googled his name. The results made my blood run cold. Local teen still missing after 3 months. The article was from our senior year. I'd known he'd vanished, of course. Remember the police interviews, the search parties, the gradual loss of hope. But somehow, over the years, I'd forgotten. How had I forgotten? The calls continued every night at midnight. Each time, David's voice grew stranger, more distorted. He reminded me of things I'd pushed deep into my memory. The way he'd started acting paranoid in the weeks before his disappearance, claiming someone was following him. How he'd begged me to believe him, and I'd dismissed his fears as drug-induced paranoia. You were supposed to be my friend, he said on the 7th night. You were supposed to help me. I didn't know, I whispered. I swear I didn't know. Liar. That word, that single word, shattered something in my mind. Memories came flooding back. Memories I'd buried so deep they'd fossilized. I did know. I'd seen the car following him home. I'd heard the footsteps behind us in the dark. But I'd said nothing, done nothing. Because I was scared, because I didn't want to get involved. The reasons felt paper-thin now, dissolving in the acid of guilt. After 2 weeks of calls, I hired a private investigator. She traced the number to an old payphone outside our high school, a payphone that had been removed 15 years ago. But the calls kept coming. Want to know what it feels like? David asked on the 20th night. Being forgotten? Being erased? The static was getting worse, his voice breaking up like a bad radio signal. In the background, I could hear other voices now. Whispers pleading, screams cut short. David, please. I'm sorry. I should have helped you. I should have. Too late, he said. Far too late. But you can make it right. Come see me. Come where they took me. Where? You know where. The place you've been avoiding for 20 years. The equipment shed. By the pool. I shouldn't have gone. Any sane person would have changed their number, moved away, done anything but drive to their old high school at midnight. But guilt is a powerful motivator, and some debts can only be paid in person. The school hadn't changed much. Same brick buildings, same chain link fence, same pool house casting long shadows in the moonlight. The equipment shed stood exactly as I remembered it. A squat concrete block painted institutional green. My phone rang. I'm here, David's voice whispered. Right where you left me. The shed door was unlocked. It swung open with a scream of rusted hinges, revealing darkness so dense it seemed solid. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated it. The smell hit me first, damp earth and old chemicals, and something underneath, something sweet and rotten. My light caught glimpses of pool equipment, old lane markers, broken skimming nets. In the far corner, something moved. David, you remember now, don't you? His voice came from my phone and from the darkness simultaneously. You remember what you saw that night? I did. God help me, I did. We hadn't been alone in the shed that night. There had been sounds, struggling, muffled screams. A figure in black, the glint of metal. I'd seen everything through a crack in the storage lockers where I was hiding. Seen them drag David away. Seen the shovel they carried. I'd said nothing, done nothing, just waited until they were gone, then run home and forced myself to forget. They needed a witness, David's voice said from the darkness. Someone to keep their secret, and you did such a good job. My flashlight beam found something on the floor, disturbed concrete, newer than the rest. A patch about 6 feet long. But now it's time to share the burden. The door slammed shut behind me. My phone died, plunging me into total darkness. In that blackness, I heard movement. The scrape of something being dragged across concrete, the soft pad of footsteps from multiple directions. Don't worry, David's voice whispered, right next to my ear. You won't have to live with the guilt much longer. They found my car the next morning, still parked by the school. They searched the equipment shed but found nothing. Just old pool supplies and undisturbed concrete. My phone showed no record of the calls, no evidence of David's number. But if you drive past Highland High at midnight, you might see a light in the equipment shed. And if you listen carefully, you might hear two voices talking. One asking for forgiveness, the other reminding him it's far too late. Sometimes, students claim they get strange calls at midnight. A man begging for help, claiming he's trapped, claiming he was abandoned by his best friend. But when they try to call back, the number doesn't exist. After all, some calls aren't meant to be returned. Some guilt can't be absolved. And some friends never let you forget what you did to them, even after they're dead, even after you've joined them. Episode 7, we had been planning the weekend getaway for months. It was supposed to be an escape from our stressful lives in the city. Just a few days of relaxation and fun. When we found Briar House, an old Victorian mansion nestled in the countryside, it seemed like the perfect spot. The price was surprisingly reasonable for such a grand estate, and we couldn't resist the idea of spending a weekend in such an atmospheric location. Little did we know, Briar House had a history, a dark past that would soon ensnare us. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The house loomed over us, its once white paint now a dull, peeling gray. Ivy crawled up the walls, giving it a gothic, eerie look. As we stepped out of the car, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I shook it off, attributing it to the chilly autumn air. "Wow, this place is something else," said Mike, one of my closest friends, as he hauled his suitcase out of the trunk. "Yeah, it's got character," added Lisa, my girlfriend, with a mix of excitement and unease in her voice. The rest of the group, Tom, Jenny, and Sarah, followed us inside. The interior was just as grand, yet unsettling, as the exterior. High ceilings, dark wooden floors, and antique furniture greeted us. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the late afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. We spent the first evening settling in, exploring the house, and sharing ghost stories around the fireplace. The atmosphere was lighthearted, our laughter filling the spacious rooms. But as night fell, the house seemed to take on a different personality. Shadows grew longer, and the old wood creaked and groaned as if it were alive. As we settled into our respective rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house seemed to breathe, the walls whispering secrets. Lying in bed that night, I heard faint, disembodied voices. I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, we gathered for breakfast in the large dining room. Lisa looked pale and tired. "Did anyone else hear noises last night?" she asked hesitantly. Everyone nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. Tom, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. "Old houses make noise. It's probably just the wind or the pipes." We spent the day exploring the nearby woods and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The fresh air and exercise did wonders for our spirits. And by the time we returned to Briar House, we were in high spirits once more. We decided to play some board games and drink a few beers to unwind. As night fell again, the atmosphere grew heavy. We heard the sound of children laughing, but there were no children around. Shadows seemed to dance just out of sight. Sarah screamed when she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, but when we rushed to check, it had vanished. We tried to keep our spirits up, but fear was starting to seep in. Lisa and I retreated to our room early, hoping for some rest. But sleep was elusive. As I lay in bed, I heard soft footsteps outside the door. I got up to check, but no one was there. The next morning, Jenny and Tom decided to investigate the history of Briar House. They drove into town and visited the local library. When they returned, they looked shaken. "We found out some things about this place," Jenny said, her voice trembling. "The former residents. They all died under mysterious circumstances. It's said that the house is cursed." Mike scoffed. "Come on, you don't really believe that, do you?" Jenny looked at him, eyes wide with fear. I don't know what to believe anymore, but the deaths. They were all violent, and no one could ever explain how it happened. That night, the atmosphere in the house was even more oppressive. The air felt thick, making it hard to breathe. We gathered in the living room, trying to stay together. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the icy air. The lights flickered, and we heard the sound of children laughing again, this time closer. The sound echoed through the halls, growing louder and more sinister. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a chorus of whispers. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around us. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" We grabbed our things and made our way to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house was holding us captive. The whispers turned into screams, and the walls seemed to close in on us. Desperate, Mike kicked open a window, and we scrambled out into the night. We ran to the car and piled in, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from Briar House, the screams fading into the distance. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house, its dark silhouette standing against the moonlit sky. I thought I saw a figure standing in the windows, watching us leave. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. We checked into a motel, exhausted and terrified. As we sat in the room, trying to process what had happened, Lisa spoke up. "Did you see them?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The figures in the windows?" We all nodded, the memories sending chills down our spines. We agreed to never speak of Briar House again and tried to move on with our lives. But the experience haunted us. Even now, months later, I can still hear the whispers at night. I see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I wake up and feel a cold hand on my shoulder. I can never shake the feeling that the house is still watching us, waiting. A few weeks ago, I received a letter in the mail. It had no return address and was written in a shaky, almost childlike hand. Inside was a single piece of paper with a simple message. "We are coming for you." I don't know who sent it or what it means, but I can't shake the feeling of impending doom. The others have received similar letters, and we're all living in fear, wondering when the house will come for us. We've tried to find answers, but the locals refuse to talk about Briar House. It's as if the entire town is in on the secret, and they're determined to keep it that way. We've considered going back to the house to try and end the curse, but the thought fills us with dread. I don't know how this will end or if we'll ever be free from the house's grip. All I know is that Briar House is more than just a place. It's a living, breathing entity with a hunger for fear and suffering, and it won't stop until it has claimed us all. I write this as a warning to anyone who might stumble upon Briar House. Stay away. Don't let its allure draw you in, because once you enter, it never lets you go. As I finish writing this, I hear the sound of children laughing in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. The air grows cold, and I know the house is near. It's only a matter of time before it finds us. I can only hope that somehow we'll find a way to break free from its grasp. But until then, we live in fear, waiting for the day when Briar House comes to claim us once more. Episode 8. I moved into my small apartment with a sense of excitement and independence. It was my first place on my own, a cozy one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of an old building. The rent was affordable, and the location was perfect, close to work and within walking distance of my favorite coffee shop. Life was good, or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting settled. The apartment had a certain charm, with its creaky wooden floors and vintage fixtures. It felt like home, but then things started to change. It began with a feeling, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I would be lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I felt like someone was watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia, the result of living alone for the first time. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger each night. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow lingering just behind my bedroom door. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it was there. I opened the door, expecting to find anything, that could explain the shadow. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the lights dim. I shrugged it off and went to bed, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. The next night, the shadow was back. This time, it was darker, more defined. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I opened the door again, but once more, there was nothing there. I checked the hallway, the living room, even the bathroom, but everything was as it should be. I went to bed with a sense of unease, my mind racing with possibilities. As the nights went on, the shadow grew larger, darker, and more menacing. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shifting and changing shape. I began to dread bedtime, knowing that the shadow would be waiting for me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but it was impossible. The shadow was real, and it was getting closer. One night, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out and touched the shadow, expecting my hand to pass through it, but it didn't. My hand met resistance, as if I were touching something solid. I pulled my hand back, my skin tingling with a strange, cold sensation. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was behind the door. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door wide, shining the beam into the hallway. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I searched the entire apartment, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I went back to bed, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The next morning, I called my friend Mark. He was a skeptic, always quick to dismiss anything remotely supernatural. I needed someone to tell me I was being ridiculous, that there was a logical explanation for everything. "Hey, Mark," I said when he answered. "Can you come over tonight? I need to talk to you about something." "Sure, man," he replied. "What's up? I'll explain when you get here. Just bring a flashlight." That evening, Mark arrived, and I told him everything. He listened patiently, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Look, I'm sure there's a logical explanation for all of this," he said. "Let's check it out together." We spent the next hour searching the apartment, looking for anything that could explain the shadow. We found nothing. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Maybe it's just stress," he suggested. "You've been working a lot lately, and moving into a new place can be overwhelming." "Maybe," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. Mark left, and I was alone again. That night, the shadow was back, darker and more menacing than ever. I lay in bed, staring at it, my mind racing with fear. I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The days turned into weeks, and the shadow continued to grow. I became obsessed with it, spending hours each night watching it, trying to understand it. I stopped going out, stopped seeing friends. My life revolved around the shadow behind the door. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I strained to hear it, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like a voice from another world, calling to me. I got out of bed and approached the door, my hands shaking. The shadow seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing me in. I reached out and touched it, feeling the cold, solid resistance. The whisper grew louder, filling my mind with a sense of dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was behind the door. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door wide, shining the beam into the hallway. The shadow was gone, but the whisper remained, echoing in my mind. I searched the apartment, my heart racing. I checked every room, every corner, but there was nothing. I went back to bed, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The next morning, I called Mark again. "I need your help," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I can't explain it, but I need you to come over." Mark arrived that evening, and I told him about the whisper. He listened, his expression serious. "Okay," he said, "let's figure this out." We spent the night searching the apartment, but we found nothing. The whisper was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Maybe you should stay with me for a few days," he suggested. "Get away from this place. Clear your head." I agreed, desperate for a break from the relentless fear. I packed a bag and left the apartment, hoping that distance would bring clarity. But even at Mark's place, the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't escape it. The shadow was always there, lurking just behind the door. The whisper returned, growing louder and more insistent. One night, I woke to find the shadow in Mark's apartment. It was darker, more menacing than ever. The whisper filled my mind, a cacophony of voices calling to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was behind the door. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door wide, shining the beam into the hallway. The shadow was gone, but the whisper remained, echoing in my mind. I searched the apartment, my heart racing. I checked every room. Episode 9. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was alone in my small, secluded house on the outskirts of town. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. I had just settled into my favorite armchair with a cup of hot tea and a good book when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the knock came again, louder and more insistent. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Who could be knocking at my door at this hour? Reluctantly, I set my book aside and made my way to the front door. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of unease, a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on my porch were two children, a boy and a girl, both around 10 years old. They were drenched from the rain, their clothes clinging to their small frames. But it wasn't their appearance that unsettled me. It was their eyes. They were completely black, devoid of any whites or irises, like two dark voids staring back at me. "Can we use your phone?" the boy asked, his voice eerily calm and emotionless. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Something about these children was deeply wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I glanced around, hoping to see a parent or guardian nearby, but the street was empty. "Please, sir," the girl added, her voice just as unsettling as the boy's. "We need to call our parents." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to shut the door and lock it, but a part of me felt compelled to help them. After all, they were just children, right? "Okay," I said finally, stepping aside to let them in. "Come in and use the phone." As they entered, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. The air inside the house seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. I led them to the kitchen, where the landline phone sat on the counter. "Here you go," I said, handing the receiver to the boy. "You can use this." He took the phone without a word and began dialing. The girl stood silently beside him, her black eyes fixed on me. I tried to avoid her gaze, but it was like a magnetic force drawing me in. "Who are you calling?" I asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Our parents," the boy replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I watched as he held the phone to his ear, but there was no sound of dialing, no beeping or ringing. He just stood there, holding the receiver, staring at me with those unnerving black eyes. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden urge to get them out of my house. "Maybe you should wait outside," I suggested, my voice trembling slightly. I'll call the police and they can help you." The boy and girl exchanged a glance, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, anger perhaps, in their eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "That won't be necessary," the boy said, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. "We're already here." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" The girl smiled, a cold, sinister smile that sent a wave of terror through me. "We just needed to be invited in." Panic surged through me as I realized too late that these weren't ordinary children. I turned to run, but the boy grabbed my arm with a grip that was far too strong for a child. His touch was ice cold, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Let go of me!" I shouted, struggling to break free. The boy's grip tightened, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. "You shouldn't have let us in," he said, his voice now a low, guttural growl. The girl stepped closer, her black eyes boring into mine. "Now you belong to us." I fought with all my strength, but it was no use. The boy's grip was like iron, and the girl's presence seemed to sap my energy. I felt myself growing weaker, my vision blurring as darkness closed in around me. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard a loud crash from the living room. The boy and girl released me, their heads snapping towards a sound. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, holding a baseball bat. "Get away from him," he shouted, swinging the bat at the children. The boy and girl hissed, their faces contorting into grotesque masks of rage. They backed away, their black eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Mr. Thompson advanced, swinging the bat wildly, and the children retreated further. "Go back to where you came from," Mr. Thompson yelled, his voice filled with determination. The children let out a final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing into thin air. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as if a dark cloud had been banished. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Mr. Thompson rushed to my side, helping me to my feet. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I nodded weakly, still trying to process what had just happened. "I think so. Thank you." Mr. Thompson glanced around the room, his expression grim. "I've heard stories about them, the black-eyed children. They say once you let them in, they never leave." I shuddered, the memory of their cold, black eyes still fresh in my mind. "What do they want?" "No one knows for sure," Mr. Thompson replied. "But whatever it is, it's not good." We spent the rest of the night in my living room, keeping the lights on and the doors locked. Mr. Thompson stayed with me, his presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone. As dawn broke, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare was over, or so I thought, but as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving just out of sight, and at night, I would hear faint whispers outside my window. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart raced, and I froze, my mind flashing back to that fateful night. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. But as I turned to walk away, I heard the knock again, louder this time. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened the door. Standing on my porch were two children, a boy and a girl, their eyes as black as the night. "Can we use your phone?" the boy asked, his voice eerily calm and emotionless. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I knew now that they weren't really children at all. They were something else, something dark and malevolent, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had to find a way to protect myself, to keep them out. But as I turned to grab my phone, I saw a shadow move across the room. They were already inside. The air grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the boy and girl standing in the doorway, their black eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You can't escape us," the girl said, her voice a chilling whisper. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out, but it was too late. They were here, and there was no escaping them. As they advanced, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I knew that this was the end, that I would never be free of them, but I also knew that I couldn't give up without a fight. I grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the boy, but he caught it effortlessly, his grip like iron. The girl stepped closer, her cold hand reaching for me. "Join us," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I fought with all my strength, but it was no use. Their grip was too strong, their presence too overwhelming. I felt myself growing weaker, my vision blurring as darkness closed in around me. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard a loud crash from the living room. The boy and girl released me, their heads snapping towards the sound. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mr. Thompson, holding a baseball bat. "Get away from him," he shouted, swinging the bat at the children. The boy and girl hissed, their faces contorting into grotesque masks of rage. They backed away, their black eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Mr. Thompson advanced, swinging the bat wildly, and the children retreated further. "Go back to where you came from," Mr. Thompson yelled, his voice filled with determination. The children let out a final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing into thin air. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as if a dark cloud had been banished. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with fear. Chapter 10, when I first met Chloe, she seemed normal. She arrived late in the semester, transferring into our dorm after some other girls suddenly dropped out. I never learned why. Chloe was quiet, almost too quiet. But in a dorm full of chaotic students, quiet wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I was just relieved that I didn't get someone who threw parties at midnight or constantly played loud music. Chloe's arrival, though, brought an unsettling calm. It was the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, like the dorm had been holding its breath ever since she stepped foot in it. The first night she moved in, I woke up around 2 a.m., drenched in sweat, my throat parched. As I blinked myself awake, I noticed something odd. Chloe was standing at the foot of my bed, her long dark hair hanging in front of her face, her head tilted slightly. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. I gasped, jerking up in bed. "Chloe?" She didn't answer. For a second, I wondered if I was dreaming. The darkness warped the room's edges, making it hard to see anything clearly. My heart pounded, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Then, without a word, Chloe turned slowly and walked back to her side of the room, sliding into her bed as if nothing had happened. I stayed up for hours, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell that had been about. But the next morning, when I woke up to the sound of my alarm, she was lying in bed, eyes closed, breathing softly like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't mention it. I figured maybe she had been sleepwalking. It was weird, but not impossible, right? Things didn't get better, though. Over the next few days, the dorm became wrong. At first, it was just little things. A cold draft that came and went even though the windows were sealed tight. My things being moved when I knew exactly where I had left them. I'd find my books stacked on my desk in strange, almost ritualistic formations, or my clothes laid out on the bed, like someone had been trying to dress me. Every time I confronted Chloe about it, she would give me the same blank stare and softly say, "I didn't touch anything." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was being paranoid. College was stressful enough as it was. And maybe I was just overthinking things. But then the night visit started. At first, I'd wake up and see Chloe just standing there at the foot of my bed, watching me. Every night, exactly at 2 a.m., she'd be there. It got to the point where I started setting an alarm to wake myself up before she could get there. But it didn't help. No matter when I woke up, Chloe would already be standing there, like she had never even gone to bed. One night, it was different. I woke up, the usual prickling of fear running down my spine. Chloe was there, but this time she was whispering something. At first, it was too quiet to make out, just the faintest murmur, like a breeze rustling through dead leaves. But as I strained to listen, I realized she was repeating the same phrase over and over. She's waiting. She's waiting. I sat up, my pulse thudding in my ears. Who's waiting? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Chloe didn't respond. She just stood there, her face still obscured by her hair, whispering those same words on repeat. I reached out to touch her, my hand shaking, but the moment my fingers grazed her arm, she collapsed. I screamed, leaping back, and watched as her body hit the floor like a sack of bricks. She didn't even try to catch herself, but as soon as she hit the ground, she started twitching, convulsing in a way that was grotesque and unnatural. I fumbled for my phone, dialing campus security with trembling hands, trying to explain what had just happened. By the time they arrived, Chloe was sitting calmly on her bed, brushing her hair, as if nothing had ever occurred. I was frantic, trying to explain what I had seen, but they gave me that patronizing look, the one they reserve for hysterical girls, and left without another word. I knew then that something was seriously wrong, but what was worse? No one else seemed to notice Chloe at all. Whenever I tried to talk about her, my friends would give me a confused look, saying, "Wait, who? I didn't know you had a new roommate." I felt like I was going insane. Chloe was real. She had to be. I'd seen her, talked to her. She had her own side of the room, her own clothes in the closet, her bed across from mine. How could no one else see her? The final straw came one cold, damp night. I had decided to stay up, refusing to fall asleep, determined to catch Chloe before she did anything strange again. I sat in bed, phone clutched in my hand, eyes trained on her still form lying in the opposite bed. At exactly 2 a.m., I blinked. She was gone. I shot out of bed, scanning the room in the dark. But the bed was empty. The closet was closed. There was no sound. Then, slowly, I turned around and saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle, watching me. Her eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the window. Her face. It wasn't her face. It was twisted, bruised, like something had beaten her beyond recognition. She smiled a slow, terrible grin that stretched her lips impossibly wide. "She's waiting," Chloe whispered again, but this time her voice was different. It wasn't soft and distant like before. It was guttural, distorted, as if someone or something was speaking through her. I backed up against the wall, trying to find my voice, but no words came out. I watched in horror as her body began to shift, her limbs lengthening, her skin turning a sickly, grayish hue. It wasn't Chloe anymore. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't her. And then, suddenly it moved. 1 second she was across the room, and the next, she was standing right in front of me, her face inches from mine. I could feel the cold emanating from her, smell the damp, earthy stench that clung to her skin. I tried to scream, but her hand shot out, covering my mouth. Her fingers were ice cold, and I could feel the brittle, bony structure beneath her skin. I struggled, but her grip was iron tight. "Don't worry," she whispered, her breath icy against my ear. "You'll see her soon." I don't remember what happened after that. Everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining through the window, and everything seemed normal, except for one thing. Chloe was gone. Her bed was stripped, her closet empty. All her things had disappeared. There was no sign that she had ever been there at all. I spent the next few days trying to find answers. I asked around, tried to talk to the resident advisor, even went to the administration, but no one could give me any information, as far as they were concerned. There had never been a girl named Chloe in my dorm. They had no record of her, but I knew what I had seen. I knew she had been real, or at least she had been something. The only thing I found was a single faded photo in the campus archives. It was from the 1960s. A picture of a group of students standing in front of one of the older dorms, the same one I was living in. And there, at the edge of the photo, was a girl with long, dark hair. Her face was blurry, her features hard to make out, but I recognized her. Chloe. I stared at that photo for hours, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why had she come back? I never got any answers. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up and feel her presence in the room. I never see her, but I know she's there. She's always waiting. And now I think she's waiting for me. Chapter 11, when our small theater troupe decided to take up residency at the old Lyric Theater, I was the only one who had doubts. I've always been a little superstitious, and the Lyric had a reputation. The place had been abandoned for years, ever since the incident in the late 70s. They said an actor, Adrian Blake, had died during the final performance of a play. Officially, it was a heart attack, but there were always whispers of something more sinister. Still, the theater was cheap, and for a struggling troupe like ours, that was all that mattered. The old grandeur of the place was undeniable. Its decaying velvet curtains and dusty chandeliers still held a certain charm, a reminder of the elegance it once possessed. But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel it, the weight of something watching, waiting. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. At first, it was subtle. Props going missing, lights flickering during rehearsals, odd drafts sweeping through the auditorium despite the windows being sealed shut. It was easy to brush off, at least at the start. The building was old, after all, and old places had quirks. But when the masked figure appeared, it became impossible to ignore. We were rehearsing a particularly tense scene one night when I noticed him, a tall figure standing in the wings, barely visible in the dim light, wearing a broken half mask that covered the left side of his face. I froze, my lines dying in my throat as I stared. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. The rest of the troupe looked at me in confusion. "Who?" Claire, our director, asked, following my gaze toward the wings. But the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "Never mind. Thought I saw something." Claire shrugged, and we went on with the rehearsal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The next few days were quiet, though the atmosphere in the theater remained thick with unease. I kept my mouth shut about the figure, figuring it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. After all, everyone knew about the ghost stories surrounding the Lyric, and I didn't want to be the one to start spreading rumors. But then others started seeing him, too. It was during a run through the final act that Claire suddenly stopped, her face pale. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the balcony. There he was again, the masked figure. This time, he was standing in the shadows of the upper balcony, his broken mask glinting faintly in the dim light. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us. No one said anything for a long moment. Then, with forced cheerfulness, Claire clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, let's take 5. As soon as we were out of earshot of the stage, I pulled Claire aside. "You saw him too, right?" She nodded, her face tight with concern. "I thought it was just me, but..." "It's Adrian Blake." Mark, one of our actors, interrupted. "It has to be..." The name sent a chill down my spine. Adrian Blake, the actor who had died here during a performance of The King's Revenge. Rumor had it that he had been wearing the same half-mask the night he collapsed. The mask, they said, had cracked when his body hit the stage, breaking in half as his life slipped away. We tried to continue with rehearsals, but it became impossible to ignore the presence in the theater. Every night, without fail, The masked figure appeared in the wings or up in the balcony, always watching, never moving. Then the accidents began. At first, they were minor, props falling, sets collapsing, lights malfunctioning, but they grew progressively worse. Claire was nearly crushed when a beam came loose during a scene change. Mark fell down a flight of stairs after feeling an unseen hand shove him from behind. Each time, the figure would be there, lurking in the shadows, his empty eyes behind the mask fixed on us. We were terrified, but we had invested too much to walk away now. Opening night was only days away, and we couldn't afford to cancel. So, despite everything, we pressed on. The night before the premiere, we were running the final scene. It was a quiet moment on stage, the tension building as the lead actor delivered his monologue. That's when the lights went out. Not just a flicker, but total darkness. We stood there, frozen, waiting for the lights to come back on. When they did, the masked figure was standing in the middle of the stage. Everyone screamed, backing away, but he didn't move. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like a marionette waiting for someone to pull the strings. The mask on his face was cracked, a jagged fissure running down the side, and his eyes were empty, hollow, as though the life had been sucked out of him long ago. "Adrian," Claire whispered, stepping forward, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering her. Then, without warning, it lunged. Claire was thrown backward, her body hitting the seats in the front row with a sickening crack. We rushed to her, but it was too late. Her neck had snapped. Panic erupted. The rest of the troupe fled, screaming, but I couldn't move. I stood there, staring at the masked figure as it slowly backed into the shadows, disappearing from sight. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed onto the stage, gasping for breath. The police arrived soon after, but they found nothing. Claire's death was ruled an accident, a tragic fall during a late-night rehearsal. They didn't believe us when we tried to explain what had happened. How could they? There was no evidence, nothing to prove that the masked figure existed at all. The troupe disbanded after that. No one wanted to step foot in the Lyric Theater ever again. No one, except for me. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just needed answers. Either way, a week after Claire's death, I found myself standing in the empty theater, the silence oppressive around me. "Adrian," I called, my voice echoing through the vast, decaying space. "I know you're here." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, slowly, I saw him, standing in the wings, just as before. His broken mask gleamed faintly in the dim light, and those hollow eyes stared back at me, unblinking. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, stepping closer despite the fear coiling in my gut. "What do you want?" He didn't respond. He never did. But this time, something was different. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel a presence, something dark, something angry. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice trembling. "We're not your enemies." The figure took a step forward and I froze. His mask, already cracked, seemed to split further, the jagged edges widening as if the weight of his rage was too much for it to bear. "Adrian," I whispered, please, but he kept coming, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The cold grew unbearable, seeping into my bones, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew in that moment that I wasn't going to leave the theater alive. Just as he reached me, the lights went out again. When they flickered back on, he was gone. I ran. I don't know how I made it out, but somehow I did. I haven't gone back since. No one has. The Lyric Theater stands empty now, its doors locked, its stage forever dark. But I can't escape the feeling that it's not over. I still see him sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, a glimpse of the broken mask, a flicker of movement in the shadows. And every night, when I close my eyes, I hear his voice whispering from the darkness. He's waiting, and I know deep down that someday soon I'll have to face him again. Chapter 12, moving into the house, had been my attempt to start over. After the divorce, all I wanted was peace, a new life for me and my son, Ethan. The countryside seemed perfect. Quiet, serene, a place where we could heal. When I first laid eyes on the old house, tucked away behind a line of trees, its weathered charm spoke to me. I could imagine us there, happy, rebuilding our lives in its cozy warmth. But I didn't know. I didn't know what the house had beneath its quaint surface. It started the first night, only hours after the movers had gone, and I'd finally managed to get Ethan to sleep. I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to drift off, when I heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot on wooden floors. At first, I thought it was Ethan, maybe wandering around in his sleep. I dragged myself out of bed, moving down the hall toward his room. The house was cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones, and my footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. When I reached Ethan's room, I pushed the door open gently. He was fast asleep, his small body curled up beneath the blankets, his breathing deep and steady. I stood there for a moment, watching him, the steady rhythm of his breath calming me. Then I heard the footsteps again, above me this time. In the attic, my heart skipped a beat. The realtor hadn't mentioned anything about the attic. I wasn't even sure how to get up there, but the sounds were unmistakable. The slow, creaking steps of someone or something moving above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through logical explanations. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a bird that had found its way into a gap in the roof. I wanted to believe that, but the footsteps were too heavy, too human. I spent the rest of that night in Ethan's room, sitting on the edge of his bed listening. The footsteps would come and go, pacing back and forth, sometimes stopping for long stretches before resuming, as if whoever or whatever it was thinking, waiting. By morning, the footsteps had stopped. The next day, I convinced myself it had all been in my head. The stress of the move, the anxiety of a new life, it had to be playing tricks on me. I didn't mention it to Ethan. He didn't need to be burdened with my fears, real or imagined. But the second night was worse. I was woken up again, this time by the sound of a door creaking open. I shot up in bed, my pulse racing, and strained to listen. There it was, the unmistakable sound of a door opening slowly, the hinges groaning under the strain. And then the footsteps, closer this time, louder. I threw off the blankets, heart pounding, and made my way down the hallway toward the attic entrance. A narrow set of wooden stairs led up to the small attic door, the kind of door you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked away in the shadows of the ceiling. The door was slightly ajar. My throat tightened. I reached for the knob, hesitating only for a moment before pulling it open wider. The cold air rushed down from the attic, carrying with it the scent of old wood and dust. I stared into the darkness above, trying to see anything beyond the narrow beam of light from my phone. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone up there?" No response, just silence, oppressive and thick. I took a step up, then another, climbing halfway up the stairs, but I couldn't bring myself to go any further. Something about the darkness beyond felt wrong, as if it were waiting for me to make a mistake, to come just a little closer. And then, from the shadows above, came the sound of footsteps, running this time, darting across the floor of the attic. I gasped, stumbling backward, nearly falling down the stairs as I scrambled away. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I tried to act normal for Ethan's sake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. I started doing research, digging through local history archives, trying to find anything about the house, but there wasn't much to go on. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and had passed through several owners over the decades. There were no stories of tragedies or hauntings, at least none that I could find. Still, the footsteps continued every night. They became more persistent, more pronounced. Some nights they were slow, as if someone were pacing thoughtfully. Other times they were frantic, like someone running in terror. And then came the whispering. It started softly, barely audible beneath the creaking floorboards. But soon, I could hear it clearly, a low, urgent whispering that I couldn't quite make out, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I pressed my ear to the attic door one night, trying to hear the words, but they were muffled, elusive, and I wasn't the only one noticing. One morning, over breakfast, Ethan looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, who's in the attic?" I nearly dropped my coffee. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He shrugged, taking a bite of his cereal. "I heard someone up there last night. They were talking." My skin went cold. "What did they say?" Ethan frowned, as if trying to remember. "I don't know, but I heard footsteps, too. They were loud." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the house settling, honey. Old houses make noises sometimes." But I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe me. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was up there. I waited until Ethan was asleep, then armed myself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, just in case. I crept up to the attic door, my hands trembling as I reached for the knob. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the dark staircase once again. I hesitated, my heart racing, but forced myself to take the first step. The attic was cold, the kind of cold that didn't come from a lack of insulation. It felt unnatural, like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind only emptiness. I swept the flashlight around, illuminating old furniture draped in sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls, but nothing else. And then I heard it, the footsteps, right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was nothing there, just the empty staircase leading down to the hallway below. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled me, moving faster, heavier, until it sounded like multiple people were running around me, their footsteps echoing in the confined space of the attic. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just whispering. They were arguing. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I screamed, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were all around me now, closer, too close. I could feel something there, in the darkness, watching me, moving toward me. The whispers became shouts, angry and desperate, but I still couldn't make out the words. My pulse thundered in my ears as I frantically searched for another way out, but there was none. I was trapped, and then the footsteps stopped. The attic was silent, too silent. I held my breath, my body frozen in fear. I could feel something in the room with me, something standing just out of sight, waiting. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft but clear now, right behind me. "Get out." I whipped around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. But there was nothing, just empty space and the oppressive weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I don't know how I got out. Somehow, I managed to pry the attic door open, stumbling down the stairs in a blind panic. I didn't stop until I was in Ethan's room, clutching him to me as if he could shield me from whatever was up there. We left the house the next morning. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the house wasn't haunted, that there was no such thing as ghosts. But I knew better. I could still hear the footsteps in my dreams, still feel the cold weight of those unseen eyes watching me. And every night, as I lie awake in our new apartment, I wait. I wait for the sound of footsteps above me, knowing that whatever had been in that house wasn't done with me yet. It never was. And whatever was up there wasn't alone. Chapter 13 had started innocuously enough. Small things at first, the kind of things you can easily dismiss. A half-eaten sandwich left out on the counter. A few crumbs scattered on the kitchen floor. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. Living alone for the past year had taught me to overlook the little oddities that come with an empty house. But after a few weeks, the leftovers started becoming harder to ignore. I'd wake up each morning to find remnants of meals I had no recollection of preparing, let alone eating. The sink would be full of dirty dishes, greasy with the remnants of something fried or cooked. Spaghetti sauce splattered across the stove, chunks of half-chewed bread on the table. Things that couldn't possibly be explained by me making a midnight snack. At first, I laughed it off. I even joked to my friends that I must be sleep eating. But after the third time it happened, the humor started to fade. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m., my stomach growling as usual. That was another thing, the hunger. Despite these nocturnal feasts that I supposedly indulged in, I'd wake up ravenous, my stomach gnawing at me as if I hadn't eaten in days. I dragged myself to the kitchen in a half-daze, flipping on the light. And there it was again, a plate of cold, greasy food sitting on the counter. This time it was chicken, the bones neatly stripped of meat, surrounded by a pool of congealed gravy. Next to it was a half-eaten loaf of bread, torn apart savagely as though someone or something had ripped it with their hands. The thing was, I don't remember eating chicken. I hadn't even bought chicken in weeks. I stood there for a moment, staring at the remnants of the meal, my heart beating faster. I felt a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine, a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air. I wasn't sleepwalking, was I? It seemed too calculated, too methodical. Something was wrong. I spent the next few nights trying to catch myself in the act. I stayed up late, reading in bed, keeping one eye on the door, waiting for the moment when my body would rise and shuffle toward the kitchen like some possessed automaton. But nothing happened. I'd fall asleep around midnight, wake up a few hours later, and like clockwork, there would be new leftovers, new strange combinations of food spread out on the counters. Cold, untouched, but definitely eaten. One morning, I woke up to find a stack of pancakes, syrup oozing off the sides, bacon strips curled up in a greasy pile next to them. The smell was overpowering, as though the meal had been cooked just minutes before. But the thing that sent a chill through me was the eggs. They weren't just scrambled eggs thrown together hastily. They were sunny side up, perfectly cooked, the yolk still soft and golden. I never made eggs like that, ever. By the end of the month, I was a wreck. My nights were restless, haunted by the mystery of the midnight feasts. I was tired of being a passive observer to whatever was going on in my own home. So, I made a plan. I decided I would stay awake, fully awake. No distractions, no drifting off. I'd sit in my kitchen, keep watch, and see for myself what was happening. I brewed a pot of coffee, pulled a chair into the corner of the kitchen where I had a full view of the counters, and sat down to wait. It was past 1 a.m. when the first strange sound came, a soft creaking, almost imperceptible, like the sound of floorboards shifting under weight. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening as I strained to listen. There was again a rustling, faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. My mind raced through possible explanations. A draft? The house settling? But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps padding through the hallway, moving toward the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. Someone or something was in the house. I reached for the knife I'd placed on the table beside me earlier, my fingers trembling as I gripped it tight. The footsteps grew closer, louder, until they stopped just outside the doorway. I held my breath, frozen in place, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, a figure emerged. At first, it looked like a person, hunched over and shuffling forward. But as it moved into the light of the kitchen, I realized it was anything but human. The creature was gone, its skin a sickly gray, stretched tight over its bones. Its face was sunken, eyes wide and glistening like black marbles, reflecting the dim light of the kitchen. Its mouth, God, its mouth was grotesque, hanging open in a perpetual gape, its teeth jagged and broken. It slithered more than walked, its limbs too long, too thin, as if someone had stretched a human body far beyond its natural limits. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing didn't seem to notice me at first, its focus entirely on the counters, where remnants of the last midnight feast still lay. With a low, guttural sound, it lunged toward the food, scooping up handfuls of bread and meat, shoving them into its mouth with a ferocity that made my stomach turn. It was feeding. No, it was devouring. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe, as I watched it tear through the food like a starved animal. The sound of its chewing was wet, disgusting, the smacking of lips and gnashing of teeth filling the room. But then it stopped. The creature froze mid-bite, as if suddenly aware of something. Slowly, its head turned toward me, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen was deathly silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. It tilted its head, its black eyes narrowing, and then it smiled. A shiver ran down my spine as its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it pointed at the food on the table, at the untouched plate. I realized, with a sickening dread, what it wanted. It was waiting for me to join the feast. My legs trembled, my grip tightening on the knife. I knew I had to get out, had to run, had to escape, but my body wouldn't move. It felt like the creature's gaze had pinned me to the spot, its black eyes boring into mine, holding me captive. The thing let out a low growl, its smile fading. It pointed to the food again, more insistently this time, as if growing impatient. I shook my head, my mouth dry, my heart pounding in my ears. "No!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the creature wasn't asking. It took a step toward me, its long fingers twitching, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. I bolted from the chair, knocking it over in my haste, and ran for the door. The creature let out a screech, a hideous, ear-piercing wail that echoed through the house as it lunged after me. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, throwing open the front door and stumbling into the cold night air. My heart pounded in my chest, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I ran, not stopping until I reached the street, the distant glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I don't remember how long I stood there, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to that house. Not with that thing inside. I called a friend, begged to stay at their place for the night. I didn't tell them the full story. I didn't know how to explain it. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't finished with me. It had been waiting, watching, and it wanted more than just a feast of food. It wanted me. Even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes, in the dead of night. A soft creak of floorboards or the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. It's waiting for the right moment to finish what it started. And every night, as I lie awake in the darkness, I wonder how much longer I can resist, how much longer I can hold out before I'm forced to join the midnight feast. Forever. Chapter 14, I've seen my fair share of strange cases over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for what unfolded in our small, quiet town, a place where everyone knew each other, where crimes were minor and mostly harmless. But then the children started disappearing. It began one warm evening in early autumn. The first child to go missing was a little girl named Emily Davis. I remember her father, Peter, storming into my office, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. Emily had been playing in the yard, as she always did after school, when she suddenly vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, No sounds to suggest anything had gone wrong. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. I sent a team to scour the neighborhood. We questioned neighbors, searched the surrounding woods, but there was nothing, no trace of where Emily had gone. Her parents were shattered. We were all unnerved, but I assured Peter that we'd find his daughter. I had to believe that. It was my job. Then, just 3 days later, another child disappeared. This time, it was a boy named Caleb, a 7-year-old who lived on the other side of town. Like Emily, he had been playing in his yard, unsupervised for only a few minutes. His mother stepped inside to answer the phone, and when she returned, Caleb was gone. It didn't make any sense. There was no way someone could snatch a child without being seen. No footprints, no clues, nothing. My gut told me there was something else at play, something sinister. But what? I had no idea. As the days passed, more children went missing, and then we noticed a pattern. A few of the parents mentioned something odd when we interviewed them again. Each missing child had been given a small, handmade doll shortly before their disappearance. The parents assumed the dolls were gifts from a neighbor or friend, a quaint gesture. No one had thought much of it until now. The dolls were unusual. They weren't like the ones you'd find in stores. These were crude, almost lifelike, with button eyes that seemed to follow you. The craftsmanship was impeccable, but there was something unnerving about them, something wrong. I began to dig deeper, trying to track down where these dolls had come from. No one seemed to know. Some of the parents claimed they'd found the dolls on their doorstep, while others said their children had mentioned a street vendor. But no one had ever seen the vendor themselves, just the children. That's when the whispering started. It was Caleb's mother, Mrs. Anderson, who first mentioned it. She came to my office late one evening, her face gaunt, her eyes haunted. "I can hear it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At night, I hear the doll. It whispers to me." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. "The doll whispers to you?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It says Caleb's name, over and over, and then it laughs. I hear it every night. I think it's trying to tell me where he is. I wanted to dismiss her claims as the ramblings of a grieving mother, but there was something in her voice, something so raw, so desperate, that I couldn't ignore it. I went to her house that night. I saw the doll, sitting in Caleb's room, propped up against his pillow. It looked innocent enough, but as I stared into its button eyes, I felt a chill creep down my spine. Mrs. Anderson left me alone in the room, and I sat there in the dark waiting. Hours passed, and I began to think I was wasting my time. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was a child's voice, soft and eerie, repeating Caleb's name in a slow, drawn-out tone. And then the laughter, high-pitched and chilling, like the sound of a child's giggle twisted into something grotesque. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Anderson was waiting for me in the hallway, her face pale. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, too shaken to speak. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, with fear. What were these dolls? Who had made them, and why? And most terrifying of all, where were the children? I threw myself into the investigation, desperate to find answers. I interviewed every parent, examined every doll. Each one was different, yet eerily similar. The same button eyes, the same stitched mouths. But no one could tell me where they came from. The children, it seemed, had simply found them, or perhaps the dolls had found them. The whispers grew louder with each passing night. Parents reported hearing their missing children's names, followed by that same haunting laughter. And it wasn't just the parents. Neighbors, too, claimed to hear the voices, echoing through the night, carried on the wind, beckoning them. I knew I was running out of time. If I didn't act soon, more children would vanish. Then the unthinkable happened. It was a Saturday afternoon when my daughter Lily came running into the house, clutching something in her hands. My heart dropped when I saw it. A doll. It was identical to the others, with its button eyes and stitched mouth. I felt a surge of panic as I snatched it from her, my hands trembling. "Where did you get this?" I demanded. She looked up at me, confused by my sudden outburst. "From the man," she said simply. "He was standing by the park." My blood ran cold. "What man, Lily?" She shrugged. "I don't know. He was wearing a long coat. He gave it to me and said it was a gift." I didn't wait. I grabbed my gun, kissed Lily on the forehead, and told her to stay inside. I had to find this man, this vendor, before it was too late. I drove to the park, my mind racing. It was empty, save for a few parents with their children. I scoured the area, searching for anyone who fit Lily's description, but there was no sign of the vendor, no man in a long coat. Days passed, and I was no closer to finding answers. The whispers in our house began almost immediately after Lily brought the doll home. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of her name, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the halls. "Lily, Lily, come play." And the laughter, that sickening, twisted laughter. I knew what was coming. I could feel it. My daughter was next. I did everything I could to keep her safe. I locked the doors, barred the windows. I even got rid of the doll, burned it in the backyard while Lily slept. But it didn't matter. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking me for trying to stop them. And then one night, I woke to find her bed empty. My heart stopped as I ran through the house, shouting her name, my voice hoarse with panic. But she was gone, just like the others. I searched for her for days, but deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. The dolls had taken her, just like they had taken the others. Weeks have passed since Lily disappeared. The town is quieter now, but the whispers remain. I still hear them at night, faint but constant, calling to me. They tell me she's waiting. They tell me the children are all waiting. And they tell me where to find them. There's an old forest on the outskirts of town, a place we all used to avoid as kids. It's dark, overgrown, a place of legends and forgotten things. The whispers tell me that's where they've taken the children. I'm sitting in my car now, just outside the edge of the woods. The doll I thought I destroyed sits in the passenger seat, untouched by the flames. Its button eyes glisten in the dim light, its stitched mouth curled into a smile. The whispers are louder now, almost deafening. I know what I have to do. I'm going into the woods. I have to find her. I have to bring her back. Or maybe she'll bring me. Chapter 15, it all started innocently enough. At least, that's what I told myself when I first began waking up in odd places around my home. I'd open my eyes and find myself in the kitchen, sitting at the dining table, or even lying on the couch, curled up under a blanket I didn't remember getting. At first, it felt more like a quirk than a problem, just my mind playing tricks on me as I slept. I shrugged it off as stress. Work had been exhausting lately, and I was balancing far too many responsibilities at once. I thought I was just pushing myself too hard, that my body was reacting by wandering around the house at night. Noir, no faux. I'd laugh it off the next morning, tell myself it was just a phase, but then it started getting weirder. One night, I woke up on the floor in the hallway, my hands pressed against the cold tile, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no memory of how I got there, no idea why I hadn't woken up sooner. That was the first time it really unnerved me, the first time I realized something wasn't quite right. I mentioned it to my best friend, Alice, the next day over coffee. "I've been sleepwalking," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "You ever had that happen before?" She raised an eyebrow, sipping her latte. "Nope, never." "You sure you're not just waking up groggy? Maybe you're not getting enough rest." "Maybe," I admitted, but there was a tightness in my chest that said otherwise. I didn't want to admit it, but the idea of moving around my house without any control was starting to gnaw at me. Alice didn't think much of it, but as the days went by, things got worse. I started waking up in stranger places once, in the bathroom with the sink running, and another time, in the backyard with the grass cold and damp beneath my bare feet. That's when I noticed the bruises. At first, they were small, just faint discolorations on my arms and legs, the kind you get from bumping into furniture. I figured I'd just hurt myself while sleepwalking, probably stumbled into something in the dark. But the bruises grew worse, deeper. Purple and blue marks spread across my skin, as if I'd been grabbed too hard, as if someone had been holding me down. I couldn't remember how they got there. Then came the blood. It was the morning I woke up in the kitchen, my hands sticky and warm with something that I couldn't place at first. I remember staring at my palms, horrified as I realized they were smeared with dark, drying blood. I checked myself for injuries, nothing. No cuts, no wounds, nothing to explain where the blood had come from. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Whose blood was it? What had I done? Had I hurt myself and not remembered it? Or had I hurt someone else? That thought haunted me for days. I cleaned the kitchen frantically, scrubbing every surface, trying to find any trace of where the blood had come from. But there was nothing, no mess, no sign of an injury, no trail of blood anywhere in the house. I couldn't shake the fear that I wasn't just sleepwalking anymore. Something was happening to me, something darker, something I couldn't control. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom. I told myself it was to ease my mind, to prove that I was just moving around in my sleep and nothing more. But deep down, I think I already knew the truth. I was afraid of what I might see. The first night passed without incident. I watched the footage the next morning, heart racing, as I fast-forwarded through hours of me sleeping peacefully in bed. No movement, no odd behavior. I felt a flicker of relief, though it didn't last long. By the third night, everything changed. I woke up in my bed as usual and immediately checked the camera. This time, my heart plummeted. The footage started off like the nights before, me lying still under the covers, my breathing even. But around 2:47 a.m., something happened. I saw myself sit up in bed, my head slowly turning toward the camera as if I was aware it was there. But my eyes, they weren't mine. They were empty, glazed over, staring directly into the lens with a hollow expression. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I watched myself rise from the bed, my movements slow and deliberate. But what happened next sent my heart racing in terror. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the dim light, I saw a figure, shadowy, tall, and hunched, standing at the edge of the room. It was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the footage. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze even through the screen. I watched as I approached the figure, my body moving toward it without hesitation. Then, just before I reached the edge of the frame, the figure vanished. I stopped, standing in place for several minutes before slowly returning to bed, lying back down as if nothing had happened. I sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. My hands were trembling. Who or what was that in my room? How long had it been there? And why couldn't I remember any of it? I set up more cameras the next night, desperate to get more answers. I placed them all over the house, in the hallway, the kitchen, even outside on the porch. I wanted to catch whatever it was, prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. But the next morning, when I checked the footage, it was worse. This time, the figure didn't just stand in the corner. It moved, slowly, deliberately. It walked through the house, following me as I sleepwalked from room to room. It never touched me, never made a sound, but it was always there, lurking in the background, just out of reach. Its form was distorted, like a shadow that didn't belong, shifting and warping with every step. And I completely unaware, continued my nightly wanderings as if nothing was wrong. Then, in the final minutes of the footage, something happened that made my blood run cold. As I returned to bed, the figure turned toward the camera. For the first time, it seemed to acknowledge the lens, its face, or what passed for a face, slowly coming into focus. I couldn't make out any distinct features, but I could feel its malice, feel the darkness radiating from it as it stared into the camera. And then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, I heard it whisper, "She's mine now." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I was shaking, fear coursing through my veins. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house, couldn't face whatever was in there with me, but I also knew I couldn't just run. This thing, whatever it was, had attached itself to me. It wouldn't matter where I went, it would follow. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, locking the door, pushing furniture against it. I left all the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep it at bay, keep me safe. But the moment I closed my eyes, I felt it. It was there, in the room with me. I didn't have to see it to know. The air was thick with its presence, the sound of my own breath loud in the silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the days that followed, I stopped watching the footage. I couldn't bear it. Every night, the sleepwalking continued, and every morning, I woke up with new bruises, new scratches, new evidence that something was happening to me, something I couldn't explain or stop. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, just a softness at the edge of my consciousness. But now they're louder, clearer. They call my name, taunt me with things I don't want to hear. I hear them even when I'm awake. And I know it's only a matter of time before I stop waking up at all. The thing that's been following me, I don't think it wants to hurt me. Not yet, at least. It's waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. I can feel it getting closer, can feel it pressing in around me, growing stronger with each passing night. I haven't told anyone about what's happening. Who would believe me? Who would believe that I'm being haunted by something I can't see? Something that only comes when I'm asleep. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The sleepwalking, the bruises, the whispers. I'm losing control. I'm losing myself. And I'm terrified of what will happen when I finally wake up and realize I'm not alone. Not anymore.